The afternoon began like any other day for the two officers standing at the checkpoint. The sun was bright, but not harsh, and the city streets moved with their usual rhythm. Cars rolled in one by one, some drivers smiling politely, others barely looking up from their steering wheels. For the officers, it was the kind of shift that felt predictable. They checked licenses, asked a few routine questions, and waved most people through without much trouble. One of the officers stretched his arms and took a slow breath, trying to stay alert. The other officer tapped his pen on the clipboard, counting down the minutes until their next break. Neither of them expected anything unusual. They had handled hundreds of stops before, and today felt no different. At least that's what they thought. A dark-colored SUV approached the checkpoint. It wasn't speeding or drawing attention, but the way it rolled to a gentle stop made one of the officers look up with curiosity. The window lowered slowly, and a man inside greeted them with a calm, polite tone. His voice was steady, the kind that made people feel he didn't scare easily. He offered a small nod as the officer stepped closer. The officer asked for the usual documents. The man handed them over without hesitation. His movements were neat and organized, as if he'd done this many times before. The officer glanced at the papers, and something about the man's calm posture made him pause. He couldn't quite place the feeling. But there was something different about him, something controlled, something disciplined. The second officer joined him, leaning slightly toward the window. The man inside waited patiently, not rushing them, not questioning their process. He kept his hands rested on the steering wheel, quietly observing the scene around him. His eyes were sharp, but his face didn't reveal irritation or fear. He looked like someone who had been trained to stay composed under pressure. The officers checked the information, but a small detail didn't seem to match in their system. It wasn't anything major, just a minor flag that required clarification. Wanting to follow procedure, the officers began asking the man a few additional questions. None of the questions were aggressive, but they were firm. The man answered politely each time, offering clear responses. Still, the officers felt unsure. They weren't getting the confidence they expected from the system. And because of that, they decided to ask him to step out of the vehicle. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded, opened the door, and stepped out with a calmness that surprised them. Even the way he stood seemed deliberate, upright, balanced, not defensive but not passive either as soon as he stepped out. A few people nearby slowed their steps to see what was happening. It wasn't a dramatic scene, just unusual enough that passersby wanted a closer look. The man remained quiet, making eye contact only when spoken to. There was something about his presence that made people around him instinctively pay attention. Though no one yet knew why, the officers continued their questions, now more detailed. They weren't trying to be harsh. They simply wanted to understand the mismatch in their system and complete their job correctly. But the man's answers were short, precise, and confident. And that confidence made them feel as though they were missing something important. One officer asked where he was heading. The man answered calmly. The other asked if he had any official identification besides the documents already given. The man hesitated for a moment, not because he was hiding anything, but because he seemed unsure whether he needed to reveal it at this point. After a brief silence, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a different card, one that looked more official. The officer took it, glanced at it, and blinked in surprise. The design was different from a standard ID. The ranking displayed on it wasn't something ordinary citizens carried. While the officer tried to process it, the man spoke gently, saying he served in the military. His tone was humble, not boastful. He didn't raise his voice or try to intimidate anyone. He simply stated it as a fact. The officer looked at the card again, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He handed it to the other officer, who read it with widening eyes. The man standing in front of them wasn't just a member of the military, he was a high-ranking Army major. For a moment, everything fell quiet. Even the sounds of cars in the background seemed to fade. The officers exchanged a quick look, realizing that this situation was no longer just a routine stop. They understood that someone of his position carried responsibilities far beyond what they dealt with on a daily basis. But despite the sudden shift, the major remained calm. He didn't use his rank to overpower the situation. He didn't lecture them or demand special treatment. He simply waited for them to continue, as if he understood they were only trying to do their jobs. The officers felt a mix of confusion and urgency. Procedure demanded that they verify identities, especially when something didn't align in the system. But now that they knew who they were speaking with, the pressure grew. They didn't want to appear disrespectful or unprofessional, yet they also didn't want to neglect their responsibility. They found themselves walking in narrow line. More people began to notice the scene, though no one knew exactly what was happening. A few pulled out their phones discreetly, just in case something noteworthy unfolded. The officers felt the eyes on them, adding to their stress. The major finally broke the silence, speaking in a calm voice. He explained where he had been, where he was going, and why there might have been a minor discrepancy in their system. His explanation was clear and logical. He didn't seem bothered by the extra questions, nor did he try to rush them. His calmness, however, only reminded the officers of how tense they were becoming. They tried to steady themselves, but the weight of the situation was growing. They now realized that every word, every action had to be measured. Any mistake, any tone that came off wrong could lead to consequences far beyond what they were ready for. The major looked at them kindly, almost reassuringly, as if he understood the pressure they felt. But the officers still struggled to decide how to proceed. They sensed the moment was bigger than them, even though the conversation remained polite and controlled. What began as a simple stop was slowly turning into something far more serious. And the officers hadn't even seen the true consequences waiting just around the corner. The tension in the air grew as the officers continued to process what had just happened. They had stopped a vehicle for a routine check. Yet now they were standing face to face with a high-ranking Army major. Their hands felt slightly shaky. In every small noise, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, even the rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the quiet space between them. The officers were trained to handle unexpected situations, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this. The major remained calm, almost as if he knew exactly what was going through their minds. He didn't look angry. He didn't look impatient. He simply waited, giving them space to process and think. There was no arrogance in his stance, no rush to dominate the situation. He stood tall, composed, and aware, a presence that naturally drew attention. One of the officers cleared his throat, trying to regain a sense of control. "Sir," he began cautiously, "we just need to make sure everything checks out with your documents." There was a minor discrepancy. His voice was polite, but firm. The kind used when trying to assert authority while not appearing rude. The major nodded slightly, his expression neutral. "I understand," he said. "I want to help make sure everything is clear. Please, go ahead with your questions." His tone was steady and respectful. The second officer stepped forward, holding the clipboard a little tighter than necessary. "Can you explain why your identification appears differently in our system?" "It's unusual and we have to follow procedure," he asked. He felt the eyes of bystanders on him now. Some were lingering nearby, pretending to look at their phones but clearly watching the interaction. Others had slowed their pace on the sidewalk, curious about the unusual scene. The major explained in a calm, measured way. "I recently had a temporary reassignment. My official records might not reflect the most current information. Everything is legitimate, but it may not match your system perfectly." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insist on being believed. He simply provided facts. Even so, the officers felt the pressure. They wanted to follow the rules, to do their job properly, but every word they spoke now carried more weight than before. They had stopped countless vehicles without incident, yet this moment was different. They were dealing with someone who had authority and training far beyond theirs, and they could feel it. The crowd around them grew slightly, though it was still quiet. People didn't interfere, but their presence added a layer of intensity. A few began taking out phones, not to create trouble, but instinctively, documenting a moment that felt unusual. The officers were aware of the cameras, and it made them even more cautious. One of the officers asked another question, trying to maintain professional control. "Do you carry any additional documentation that can confirm your status?" he asked. The major nodded. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another card, different from the first, and handed it over carefully. The officer took it, examining it more closely this time. The weight of reality hit him again. This was no ordinary person. This was someone with significant responsibility, someone who could change the direction of this encounter in an instant. The major explained the card briefly. This verifies my rank and position. It should clarify any discrepancies. I hope this helps. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no challenge. Just calm, clear communication. The officers looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. They realized they had to act carefully, yet still complete their duties. This was no longer a simple stop. It was a delicate situation requiring respect, protocol, and patience. One wrong word or movement could make things worse, and both officers felt that tension pressing down on them like a heavy weight. The major's calm presence contrasted sharply with the officers' inner turmoil. They could feel their adrenaline rising, a mixture of stress and awareness. Every small gesture, every glance, every word mattered. And yet, the major showed no sign of using his authority to intimidate them. It was as if he understood that maintaining composure could resolve this more effectively than asserting power. As the officers tried to proceed, one of them suggested moving the conversation slightly away from the checkpoint area. The major agreed immediately, walking to the side of the road with careful, measured steps. The officers followed, feeling the eyes of the public still on them. People whispered quietly, some shaking their heads, some silently observing. Once they moved to a quieter spot, the officers continued their questions. They asked about travel plans, military assignments, and the temporary mismatch in records. The major answered every question with clarity, never showing irritation or impatience. His calmness forced the officers to match it, even as their stress grew. One officer took out a pen to note details. Trying to focus on paperwork while keeping his attention on the major, the other scanned the area. Aware of the subtle judgments of bystanders, they realized that their behavior was being watched, their actions scrutinized, and any sign of rudeness or aggression could quickly escalate the situation. The major noticed the subtle tension. He spoke gently. I understand this is unexpected. I don't want to make your job harder, and I want to cooperate fully. I hope we can resolve this quickly. His words were measured, considerate, and human. He wasn't commanding them. He wasn't threatening. He was simply trying to ease the process, which made the officers realize that they were the ones in danger of overreacting. Despite his calmness, the officers couldn't help but feel an edge of anxiety. They had to balance professionalism with the awareness that they were dealing with someone of high rank. Their training had prepared them for confrontation, but not this type of subtle, tense interaction. Each question, each response, had to be precise, polite, correct. The crowd around them began to disperse slightly, sensing that nothing explosive was about to happen. But some stayed curious, whispering among themselves about the unusual encounter. The officers felt the shift in atmosphere. It was no longer just a routine stop with a minor discrepancy. It had become a moment that required careful judgment, awareness, and patience. The major, noticing their lingering tension, offered a small smile, not sarcastic, not dismissive, but human and understanding. It was a subtle gesture, but it conveyed reassurance. The officers, for a moment, felt a strange mix of relief and unease. They understood that one misstep could have serious consequences. Yet the major's patience made them reflect on their approach and behavior. By the time the officers started finishing the verification process, they were more cautious, more measured. They realized that this stop could not be rushed, that every interaction mattered. They were learning, in real time, the weight of responsibility, not just their own, but the responsibility of interacting with someone whose role carried national significance. The major, standing quietly and cooperating fully, made it clear that respect and composure could guide the situation better than any assertion of rank or authority. The officers felt a mix of admiration and pressure. They knew that what had started as a simple traffic stop was evolving into something much larger, and that the next steps they took could have consequences beyond what they had imagined. The atmosphere at the checkpoint had shifted completely. What started as a routine traffic stop had become a moment of quiet tension. With the two officers now fully aware of the importance of the person they were speaking to, inside, their minds raced. They were trained to handle unexpected situations, but they had never imagined encountering someone with authority so high. Someone whose rank carried serious weight and influence. Every small decision now felt like it could tip the situation in the wrong direction. After carefully reviewing the major's documents and confirming the details, the officers realized that they needed guidance. This was no longer a standard stop. It required consultation with their supervisors. One officer picked up the radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he called in. The voice on the other end sounded calm but firm, asking for the details of the situation. He explained the situation step by step, mentioning the discrepancy and revealing the major's rank. The reply was swift. They were told to hold their position, not to escalate, to remain professional until someone from higher authority could arrive. Hearing this, the officers felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because they weren't solely responsible anymore. Anxiety because they now understood the seriousness of what was happening. They knew that any mistake could have consequences not just for themselves, but potentially for the entire department. Meanwhile, the major stayed calm and composed, almost as if he sensed the inner struggle of the officers. He didn't appear impatient or frustrated, though he must have been aware of the tension. Instead, he continued to answer their questions politely, repeating information when necessary, explaining procedures, and showing patience that was almost remarkable. Every word he spoke carried a sense of authority without arrogance, a rare quality that seemed to calm the situation. Even while making the officers feel the weight of their error, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Most were keeping their distance, curious but cautious, sensing that this was not an ordinary incident. Some whispered quietly, speculating about what was happening. Others recorded the scene with their phones. The presence of these onlookers added pressure, making the officers even more aware that their actions were being observed, judged, and potentially shared beyond the street they stood on. Every movement, every word, was now under the microscope. The first officer tried to continue with the questioning. He asked about the travel plans of the major, not because he doubted him, but to maintain the formality of the procedure. The major responded clearly, explaining where he had come from and where he was heading. He even mentioned a recent official meeting he had attended, offering context that helped the officers understand why certain records might not match their system. His tone remained calm, his eyes steady, and his body language relaxed, yet confident. The second officer, feeling the pressure mounting, checked the documents once more. He examined dates, signatures, and stamps, trying to confirm the authenticity of everything. The major observed silently, patiently, without interrupting or showing any sign of irritation. The officers could feel the eyes of the public and the major on them, a combination that made them hyper-aware of every action. They realized that this was more than just a simple check. It was a test of their professionalism, judgment, and patience. After a few more minutes of verification, the officers felt a sense of unease creeping in. They had done everything they could to follow procedure, but now they had to wait for higher authority. The major noticed this and spoke quietly, in a tone meant to reassure rather than command. "I understand that this is unusual," he said. "I don't want to make your job harder, and I am happy to cooperate fully. Please take the time you need to resolve this properly." His words were measured, showing empathy, and they helped calm the nerves of the officers slightly. Despite the major's calmness, the officers could feel the stakes rising. They knew that any mistake, any hint of disrespect, could lead to serious consequences. Their training had prepared them for confrontation with ordinary citizens, but this was different. This was someone whose decisions and authority could have implications far beyond the street they stood on. They had to handle it with care, precision, and respect. Minutes passed slowly. The officers checked their radios again, waiting for guidance from the station. When finally a supervisor arrived, the tension shifted slightly. The presence of someone higher in the chain of command gave the officers a measure of relief. But it also reminded them that their actions were being scrutinized. The supervisor quickly assessed the situation, spoke briefly with the major, and then turned to the officers. He instructed them to continue following protocol, but emphasized the importance of respect and awareness when dealing with military personnel. The officers nodded, absorbing the instructions. The supervisor then spoke directly to the major, thanking him for his patience and cooperation. The major simply smiled politely, a small human gesture that conveyed understanding and calmness. He did not make a scene. He did not demand recognition. Yet the officers could sense the quiet authority in his demeanor, with guidance from the supervisor. The officers resumed their duties, but everything felt different now. The stop was no longer routine. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and awareness. They realized that a single routine encounter could escalate if not handled with care, and that the weight of responsibility extended beyond the simple act of checking documents. The major continued to answer questions calmly, explaining procedural details and offering clarifications that helped the officers complete their verification. The conversation remained professional, respectful, and controlled. Yet the undercurrent of tension never fully disappeared. Every word, every movement mattered, and the officers were keenly aware of the consequences of any mistake. As the situation neared resolution, one of the officers reflected silently on what had occurred. They had faced a moment that tested their composure, judgment, and professionalism. They had learned in a matter of minutes the importance of patience, empathy, and awareness in dealing with situations that were far from ordinary. The major had handled himself with dignity, calmness, and respect, setting an example of how authority could be exercised without arrogance. Finally, the verification was complete. The officers confirmed the documents, thanked the major, and allowed him to continue on his way. What could have been an embarrassing or confrontational encounter had been managed with composure, guidance, and mutual respect. Yet, the officers knew that the story would not end here. Their actions had consequences that would be reviewed, discussed, and analyzed by the department. As the major drove away, the officers watched silently, absorbing the lessons from the encounter. They had experienced firsthand how quickly a routine stop could become a significant incident, and they understood the importance of handling each moment with care, awareness, and respect. The presence of authority, composure, and patience had transformed what could have been a confrontation into a learning moment, one they would not forget anytime soon, even after the major disappeared from view. The officers remained at the checkpoint, reflecting on what had just occurred. They felt a mix of relief, admiration, and a lingering sense of responsibility. The crowd dispersed, but the memory of the encounter stayed vivid. The officers knew that the rest of the day and perhaps the weeks to come would be influenced by what had happened here. They had been reminded in no uncertain terms that authority could take many forms, and that respect, patience, and awareness were crucial in any interaction, especially one that seemed ordinary at first glance, but turned out to be far more complex. The encounter with the Army major had ended, but for the two officers, the day was far from over. Back at the station, the weight of what had happened settled heavily on their shoulders. They sat quietly in the briefing room, glancing at each other, unsure where to begin. Their minds replayed every detail of the calm, precise way the major had answered questions, the quiet authority in his stance, the tension they had felt as bystanders watched them from the street. A supervisor entered the room, carrying a folder with notes and a tablet showing the recordings from body cameras and nearby bystanders. The supervisor's expression was serious, but not angry. "We need to review what happened carefully," he said. "This isn't just a routine traffic stop. You were dealing with a high-ranking officer, and everything you did will be examined." The officers nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and responsibility. They knew that mistakes had consequences, but now the implications felt much larger than they had imagined. The supervisor began playing the footage from the checkpoint, showing the major stepping out of the vehicle, the questions being asked, and the calm yet firm way he had responded. Watching the video, the officers noticed things they had missed in the moment. The major's body language had been confident but non-threatening. His eyes were calm, his voice steady, and he had handled their questions with patience that was almost unusual in tense situations. They realized that it wasn't just their actions under Review I-8, was also the way they had interacted, how carefully they measured their tone, and whether they had followed proper procedure. The supervisor paused the footage at several points, pointing out key moments. Notice how he remained calm, even when you pressed on with additional questions. That's someone trained to handle pressure. Now look at how your body language changed when you realized who he was. You both tightened, hesitated, and for a moment lost confidence. That's understandable, but it's also something we need to address. The officers exchanged quiet glances, feeling the truth in the words. They had been caught between doing their duty and respecting someone's position. And in the process, they realized they had underestimated the complexity of the encounter. They had been prepared for routine stops, for ordinary interactions, but not for a situation where authority came in a form they weren't expecting. The supervisor continued, explaining that an official review would be conducted by the Internal Affairs Division. They would examine the officers' actions, the recordings, and any witness statements. It was not a matter of punishment alone, but of understanding whether protocol had been followed, and whether the officers had maintained professionalism under unusual circumstances. One of the officers swallowed hard. "Sir, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just following procedure," he said, his voice quiet. The supervisor nodded. "I know that. And your intentions were not in question. But the way we handle unexpected situations is important. You were dealing with someone who has authority far beyond what you encounter daily. How you manage that is what we need to learn from this." The officers spent the next hour going through every detail of the incident. They described what they remembered, how they had felt when the major first stepped out of the vehicle, and how their perception of the situation had changed once they saw his identification. They explained their thought process in asking questions, checking documents, and waiting for guidance from the station. The internal review was thorough. The investigators asked questions about every step, every word spoken, and every gesture made. The officers realized that the consequences of a simple stop had grown far beyond what they could have imagined. Their actions were being analyzed not just for legality, but for professionalism, judgment, and awareness. One investigator pointed to the recording of the officers' interaction with the crowd outside. "See how bystanders were recording? Every action you take in a public space matters. People notice more than you think. You have to stay composed, even under pressure." The officers nodded, feeling the weight of that reality. They understood that in a world where anyone could record an incident, professionalism was never optional, it was essential. After hours of questioning and reviewing, the officers were asked to step aside while the review board deliberated. They waited in silence, reflecting on the encounter. Both felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief, because nothing disastrous had occurred, and apprehension because the outcome of the review would determine their immediate future in the department. The board reconvened, and the supervisors explained the preliminary findings. While the officers had acted with good intentions, the review highlighted areas that needed improvement. The officers had been cautious, but they had allowed uncertainty and tension to influence their actions in ways that could have been handled more professionally. As a result, the department decided on disciplinary measures, not severe, but meaningful. Both officers would face temporary suspension, receive additional training on protocol for interactions with military personnel, and attend workshops on de-escalation and situational awareness. The goal was not punishment, but growth. The department wanted them to understand the importance of composure, communication, and respect for authority in every encounter. No matter how routine it seemed, the officers accepted the outcome with a quiet sense of understanding. They had learned a lesson that went beyond procedure. They understood now how quickly a normal day could turn complicated, and how every choice mattered in shaping the outcome of an interaction. They also recognized the professionalism of the major, who had managed the situation with grace, patience, and respect, setting an example for how authority could be exercised without intimidation. Even after leaving the review, the officers felt the impact of the incident. They replayed the encounter in their minds, thinking about what they could have done differently, how they could have maintained composure more effectively, and how they could handle similar situations in the future. They realized that professionalism was not just about following rules. It was about understanding context, respecting authority, and keeping emotions in check. Even when faced with unexpected circumstances, outside the station, life went on as usual. People walked the streets, cars passed by, and the city moved at its normal pace. But for the two officers, nothing felt ordinary anymore. They had experienced firsthand how quickly a routine stop could escalate, and how much responsibility came with even the smallest decisions. They had learned to respect authority in a deeper way, to measure their words and actions carefully, and to understand that patience and calmness could resolve situations far more effectively than confrontation or aggression. By the end of the day, the officers had a clearer sense of their role and the expectations placed upon them. They had faced a moment that tested their judgment, professionalism, and composure. They had seen how authority could manifest in subtle, powerful ways, and they had learned that respect, patience, and awareness were critical in every encounter. The incident became a quiet turning point in their careers, a reminder that even the most routine situations could carry unexpected challenges. And while the temporary suspension and training were part of the consequences, the real lesson was deeper, one that would stay with them long after the paperwork was completed and the review closed. They understood now that professionalism was about more than rules. It was about character, awareness, and the ability to navigate moments that tested not just authority, but humanity itself. The officers returned to their duties after completing the review and training, but the memory of the encounter with the Army Major lingered in their minds. Each time they approached a routine stop, they could feel the lessons from that day shaping their actions. They moved more deliberately, spoke more carefully, and observed more closely, understanding that even small moments could carry unexpected importance. It was not easy to forget how the Major had handled the situation. His calmness, patience, and dignity had left a lasting impression. He had not raised his voice, nor had he demanded special treatment, yet he had commanded respect simply by the way he carried himself. The officers realized that authority was not just about rank or power. It was about presence, awareness, and how one treated others under pressure. Weeks passed, and word of the incident spread quietly through the department. The story was discussed in briefings and workshops, not as gossip, but as an example of how routine encounters could evolve unexpectedly. New officers were shown the body camera footage as part of their training, learning to handle situations with calmness, patience, and respect, just as the Major had demonstrated. For the two officers, the experience became a personal lesson as well. They reflected on their own reactions during the stop, these small moments of hesitation, the tension that had crept in, and the awareness that their actions were being watched, not just by the Major, but by the public. They understood that professionalism was not a checklist, but a mindset, one that required constant attention and self-awareness. One afternoon, as they were assigned to a new checkpoint, the officers remembered how the Major had explained things clearly and calmly, without accusation or complaint. They realized that clear communication could defuse tension and help people understand each other better. They began practicing this approach, speaking with drivers in a calm and respectful tone, explaining procedures and listening carefully to responses. They noticed the difference immediately. People reacted more positively. Conversations flowed more smoothly. Situations that could have escalated remained calm. The officers also became more aware of their own body language. They remembered the moment when the Major's calm stance had made them aware of their own tension. Now, they consciously maintained posture, eye contact, and gestures that conveyed professionalism without aggression. They learned that how they carried themselves often mattered as much as what they said. Over time, the temporary suspension and training no longer felt like punishment. Instead, the officers recognized them as opportunities to grow and improve. They appreciated that the department had not only corrected their errors, but had also invested in helping them become better professionals. The experience taught them humility, patience, and the importance of understanding the broader context of every encounter. The Major's example stayed with them. They recalled how he had cooperated fully, answered every question thoughtfully, and remained calm even under pressure. They realized that patience and composure could often achieve more than force or confrontation. They carried this lesson into every interaction, not just with drivers, but with colleagues and the public alike. One day, months later, they were approached by a senior officer who had observed their progress. He commented on how noticeably their demeanor had improved, how they handled stops with more confidence and respect, and how their interactions were now smoother and more professional. The two officers exchanged a quiet glance, remembering the day at the checkpoint, and felt a sense of quiet pride. They had faced a challenging situation, learned from it, and grown stronger because of it. The incident also gave them a new perspective on authority and respect. They understood that authority was not something to challenge blindly, but something to recognize and navigate thoughtfully. They realized that every person they encountered might have experiences, responsibilities, and pressures that were not immediately visible. Treating people with understanding and respect became their guiding principle. Even in the most routine of stops, their colleagues noticed the change as well. The officers' calm approach and professionalism set an example, influencing the tone and culture at the checkpoints where they worked. Other officers began adopting similar methods, emphasizing patience, clear communication, and awareness. The ripple effect of one tense encounter with a high-ranking officer had created a broader shift in behavior and understanding. The two officers often reflected privately on the day of the stop. They remembered the subtle lessons hidden in the major's calmness, the power of presence, the importance of listening, the ability to stay composed under pressure. They realized that these lessons were not just for professional encounters, but for life itself. Patience, clarity, and respect could help navigate conflicts, misunderstandings, and unexpected situations far beyond the streets of the city. Eventually, the incident became more than a story of tension or consequence. It became a story of learning, growth, and reflection. The officers carried the lessons forward, understanding that every encounter held the potential to teach them something new. They recognized that mistakes were part of learning, and that acknowledging them with humility and a willingness to improve was far more valuable than simply avoiding error. In quiet moments, the officers would recall the calm voice, the steady eyes, and the composed demeanor of the major. They understood now that leadership was as much about character as it was about rank. The way someone handled pressure, communicated clearly, and treated others respectfully could have a lasting impact, not only on the immediate situation, but on everyone who witnessed it. The story of the stop, the review, and the lessons learned became a quiet guide for the officers in all aspects of their work. They approached each day with heightened awareness, measured their actions carefully, and spoke with clarity and patience. The incident with the major remained a touchstone, a reminder that professionalism, respect, and composure were the true marks of authority and responsibility. As time passed, the officers continued their duties with a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer the same as they had been on that quiet afternoon at the checkpoint. They had been tested, faced consequences, and learned from their experience. They understood the importance of humility, awareness, and respect in every encounter, and they carried these lessons into every stop, every conversation, and every interaction. Looking back, they realized that what had seemed like a moment of tension and challenge had become one of the most important experiences of their careers. The encounter had shown them the value of patience, the importance of careful observation, and the power of calm authority. It had reminded them that every person, no matter their role or rank, deserved respect and understanding. And in learning these lessons, the officers grew not only as professionals, but also as individuals, ready to face the unpredictable challenges of their work with confidence, humility, and grace.